Hello and welcome to your 6th podcast on a poem, and this time it's all about The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, as you're watching this video, it would be helpful if you had a copy of the Poetry Workpack Summer 2 Part 2, just because a lot of the things in the workpack go along with the video. But don't worry if you haven't got a copy, you can just make any notes on lined paper. Remember, you can pause this video at any time to answer questions, or you can rewind it and watch bits that you don't understand the first time, but just take it at your own pace. So step 1 is to read all about the context of the poem and to understand the writer's message, and then to learn all of that information. So before I start talking about the poet himself, we need to understand a little bit about the Crimean War. Now, I'm going to give you quite a lot of information here, but just take your time listening to it and then you'll have a good understanding of what was going on. And on the next slide, there's a few questions if you want to try those out and test your knowledge. So, the Crimean War was a war between Russia and Turkey, and it started in 1853 and it ended in 1856. That's the Crimean War. During this war, Britain fought for Turkey, and this was because Russia was trying to take over Romania, and Britain were worried that they would take over India as well. And if Russia did manage to take over India, it would have destroyed Britain's trade routes. So basically, it was a war all about money and business. Britain only got involved because it thought it would interrupt their trade routes, so they fought on the side of Turkey. The Battle of Balaclava was a famous battle during the Crimean War. The soldiers involved in this battle were called the Light Brigade, and they were called the Light Brigade because the soldiers and their horses didn't have much armour. The Light Brigade were never really meant to fight. They were there to observe what was going on and report back. That was their main job. So they didn't have a lot of armour on because they were never supposed to fight in this war. 3 upper-class soldiers were in charge of the Light Brigade, and they were called Lord Lucan, Lord Raglan and General Cardigan, and they were in charge of what the Light Brigade did. The Light Brigade was supposed to be stopping Britain's guns being taken by the Russians, but there was a miscommunication in the chain of command. So one of the leaders made a mistake, and the Light Brigade got sent to charge into a valley that was lined with Russian cannons. The Light Brigade knew when they were given this command that it must have been a mistake because they didn't have the right armour on for the task, but they had to do as what they were told. They had to follow the chain of command, and that meant that most of them died during the attack. So basically, the Light Brigade died because of a miscommunication and someone gave them the wrong order. So they ended up charging into a valley full of Russian cannons, and they couldn't say no. They had to follow the commands that they were given. So I've just given you a lot of information about the Crimean War all on one slide, and you might have missed some of it, or some of it you might not have understood. So the best thing to do is have a go at answering these questions. You might need to refer back to the last slide to help you answer them, but it will help consolidate your knowledge so you'll understand what went on in the Crimean War. So pause the video now, just have a quick go at answering these questions. So now I'm going to give you some information about the poet himself, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson was a poet in the Victorian era. There's a picture of him. When he was growing up, he saw a lot of poverty, so a lot of his poems criticised the upper classes. He was the poet laureate at the time of the Crimean War, like Simon Armitage is our poet laureate now. And that meant that he was the royal poet, so he wrote poems about special occasions. He was like the poet that represented our country. During the Crimean War, a news report came out that told the horrible truth about what happened to the Light Brigade. There's a picture of the news report. I don't expect you to read it, but just so you can see what it looked like. So that news report told all about what had really happened, that these men were told to charge into a valley lined with Russian cannons. When he read this report, because Tennyson got to read it when it came out, it described the mistake that Lord Raglan, General Cardigan and Lord Lucan had made as a hideous blunder. There it is, you can see the words hideous blunder. And when he read that, those words really stuck in his head. And funnily enough, this was the same article that Florence Nightingale read that made her go and help out at the Crimean War. So it obviously had a big effect on her as well. So these words, hideous blunder, really stuck in his head. Tennyson wanted to write a poem about the Light Brigade when he read this article. Because he was poet laureate, he couldn't write a poem that made Britain sound silly and incompetent, like useless. But instead, his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, focused on how brave they were, just focused entirely on the bravery of the Light Brigade, because they followed their commands, whatever they were, and they were brave charging into that valley of Russian cannons. Next, we need to talk about Tennyson's message. Why did he write the poem? What was he trying to say? What message was he trying to get across? Here's the message your teachers have come up with. We said that Tennyson perhaps wrote the poem to celebrate and honour the brave men who fought against impossible odds. So he's honouring the Light Brigade who, even though they were given these directions to go into a place where they would surely die, they were brave enough to follow the orders that they were given. So it's sort of celebrating and honouring the Light Brigade. Okay, so you might remember that step 2 has got 2 parts to it, but I'll take you through them one at a time. So the first part is to read the poem twice. I'm just going to read it to you once on this video, but when you're revising for a poem at home, always read it through a few times before you start revising it, because the more times you read it, the more you'll get out of it. Now, before we start reading the poem, I'm just going to quickly talk you through what happens in it, but it's very simple. So the poem begins with the Light Brigade receiving the order from General Cardigan to charge into the valley lined with Russian cannons. And it tells you in the poem that they knew, the Light Brigade knew it must have been a mistake, but they had to follow the orders and they didn't answer back, they just did as they were told. And then it talks about them charging into the valley and it calls it the Valley of Death. They charge into it and the cannons are firing at them and they do their best to fight back and they fight bravely. And then when they fought, they turn back, come back out of the valley, but this time there's hardly any of them left because so many have died. And that's what happens in the poem. And at the end, he tells us to honour them. So I'll just read it to you now. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the Valley of Death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not, though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. The second part of step 2 is all about looking for structural features in the poem and analysing those. Now you've got in front of you here the Glossary of Structural Features, and you should have a copy of this in your pack. But basically all it is just some of the structural features that come up in quite a lot of the poems in the anthology. So what I want you to do now is take a few minutes, have a look at this Glossary of Structural Features and have a look at the poem and try and find any of these structural features that Tennyson has used in the Charge of the Light Brigade. And if you want to really challenge yourself, think to yourself, why has Tennyson used these features? What could they symbolise? What could they have been used to represent? Even if you can just find one or two, that would be fantastic. So hopefully you've managed to find one or two structural features of your own in this poem, but I'm actually going to talk to you about one that isn't on the glossary, something new, because the Charge of the Light Brigade has a structural feature that none of the other poems in the anthology has. So let me talk you through that now. The Charge of the Light Brigade is written in what we call dactylic metre, and this means one stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. So it makes this pattern. And you can hear it in the phrase half a league, and that's dactylic metre. So Tennyson uses dactylic metre throughout this poem. So then we think about why that's been used. How could Tennyson's use of dactylic metre symbolise the bravery of the men? And one of the things you could say about this would be the dactylic metre sounds like horses' hooves thumping on the ground. Tennyson may have used this to symbolise that the men never stopped charging. They always rode on, despite the danger that they faced. Because obviously this dactylic metre creates this sound of horses' hooves. like they're constantly charging. However much danger they're in, they never ever turn back. And that's why Tennyson might have used dactylic meter in this poem. Okay, so step 3 is to read the additional information on the poem and then to answer the questions. So if you're revising for a poem at home using your pack, there'll be a page on each poem that's just called additional information. And that could be anything. It could be a little bit more information about the poem itself. It could be a bit of context information. It could be something to do with the language of the poem. And all you need to do is read that information and afterwards answer the questions on it. So the additional information for the Charge of the Light Brigade is about the form of the poem and a little bit on the language too. So I'll go through that with you now and then you can have a go at answering the questions. So first of all, Tennyson wrote this poem in the form of a ballad. So we looked at Ozymandias in podcast 5 and that was in the form of a sonnet, but this one is ballad form. That's the form that he chose to write the poem in. A ballad is a poem that tells a story. They stem back from medieval times and they usually have a refrain. That means a bit that keeps getting repeated all the way through the poem. The idea of a ballad is that the story is passed down from generation to generation so it never gets forgotten. Because a ballad is quite easy to remember because it's got that repetitive bit. People should be able to remember it and pass it down through generations so some stories never get forgotten because they're written in ballad form. So you've got to think to yourself, why would Tennyson write this poem in the form of a ballad? Why would he want this poem never to be forgotten? And the next thing that the poem contains is biblical allusion. So if you've seen the line Valley of Death, that actually alludes, it's a line from Psalm 23 of the Bible. So it comes from this part of the Bible. You might have heard of this because sometimes it is at big church services or it might be at a funeral and it says, "Yea," which means even, "though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And that's the bit that it's been taken from. So you can see the word valley of the shadow of death, and we've got valley of death in this poem. And all that bit means is, even when I'm in my absolute darkest times, God is with me. When it says thou, it means God is with me. So it's basically saying that in the dark times, God is with you. So he may have used this to suggest that God has always been with the Light Brigade, even through their darkest time in that Valley of Cannons. Okay, I'll give you the questions now on the next slide. You can have a go at thinking about this a little bit more deeply. Okay, so I've been through the additional information with you now, and these are the questions for you to have a go at answering. So they're all based on the stuff from the extra information and maybe a couple of other things just about the poem in general. So you will need to be able to see the poem when you're answering these questions. Now you do have a copy of these questions in your pack, but if you don't want to use that or if you don't have a copy of the pack, just pause the video and answer the questions on line paper. Step 4 is to complete the theme sheet for the poem. So if you've watched any of these videos before or you've been working through your pack, you'll know how to do this by now. But basically, in your pack, you've got a sheet that looks like this. Down the left-hand side, you've got lots of different themes that could come up in the GCSE. So themes like power, conflict, the power of nature, the power of man. And all you need to do is note down next to each theme how that theme could link to the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. So I've done a couple for you. So for example, power, I've said, well, the soldiers are powerless to the commands of their leaders. And then I've put, but the soldiers are powerful in a way as well, because they're brave when they ride into the valley that's lined with Russian cannons. And for the reality of war, I've put, this poem almost ignores the mistake made by the leaders, and it just focuses on the reality of how brave the Light Brigade were. So have a go at this yourself. If you've got it in your pack, you just fill the table in. But if not, just write down the themes on one side of a piece of paper and next to it, write down how they could link to this poem. If there's any theme that you just don't think links at all, just put a cross next to it because you don't have to fill every single space in. But really try to think about how each theme could link to this poem. So step 5 is to learn the top quotes and the analysis for these quotes and to test yourself. So it's not enough just to learn the quotes off by heart. You also need to learn what you could say about those quotes. So what language features have they got in them and what could you say about those? So when you're revising quotes, don't just revise the quotes, revise what you could say about the quotes as well, because that will really help you in an exam situation. Now, in your pack, the top quotes come in table form. Just a table that says the quote and then it's got some analysis next to it. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to take one quote at a time and just explain it, and you can take notes. So our first top quote is this one: "All in the Valley of Death rode the 600. And we've already touched upon this in the video, so a lot of this will be going over the same thing. First of all, Valley of Death is a metaphor. It may have been used by Tennyson to represent the certainty that many of the men will die. Their chance of survival, once they've been given that order, was almost impossible. So that Valley of Death is a metaphor, and it shows us that it's certain these men will die. Valley of Death is also biblical allusion, as we've already said, and it alludes to Psalm 23 of the Bible. That's what you'd say if you were writing about it. You'd say it alludes to Psalm 23 in the Bible. Psalm 23 says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And that basically means in the darkest of times, God is with me. So if you're going to write about that biblical allusion, you might say something like this. Tennyson may have alluded to Psalm 23 to symbolise the fact that God is with the Light Brigade. It makes it sound like God is supporting them because of their bravery. So it really backs up this idea that God is on their side because they're so brave, and it reinforces how brave these men were. Okay, so key quote 2 is, "Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die." Now, as you can see, this is a much more negative quote. It's not really focusing on the bravery of the men. It's a quote you would use if you were writing an essay about conflict being negative, war being wrong. It's the sort of quote you could use for that. So I've included this in here as well, so we've got a bit of a balance. So let's have a look at the language features. First of all, we've got the repetition of the word theirs. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And it almost sounds quite robotic. So it may have been used to symbolise that the men were indoctrinated, they were brainwashed into following commands. It makes them almost sound robotic. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why. So it sounds quite robotic, which could symbolise that they have been indoctrinated into following these commands, whatever the commands were, however much it meant risking their lives. As well, theirs not is negation, and it may have been used to emphasise the lack of voice that the soldiers have. They've got to obey without question. They've not got a say. They're lacking a voice in this situation. Key quote 3 is, "When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made." Now, this quote is taken from the end of the poem, where Tennyson is almost directly talking to the reader. And this is a very positive quote in terms of honouring the men, saying how brave they are. So let's have a look at the language features in it. First of all, when can their glory fade is a rhetorical question. And it almost forces the reader to agree that the glory of the Light Brigade will never fade. Because they've been so brave, they will live on in history. It makes us agree with him. The word glory has got religious connotations in a way, because we usually associate it with God. We've got things like glory to God that's sung in religious hymns. So perhaps Tennyson's used the word glory to sort of suggest that the men have got godlike bravery, or to suggest that God is happy with them. Because you've got to remember that this was written in the Victorian era, which was quite a religious time. A lot of people believed in God, a lot of people feared God. So this word glory suggests again that God is supporting them, or that they are almost godlike because they're so brave. And then we've got the word wild, the adjective wild. Now that's got connotations of something being powerful and uncontrollable, like a wild animal. And so it sort of makes the reader respect the men, because we think, oh, they're powerful and uncontrollable. And it makes us respect their bravery even more. So quite a lot you can get out of this quote. And there might be some more things that you'll think of as well. And lastly, key quote 4, "Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. These are the last lines of the poem, so it's the sort of thoughts that we're left with as we finish reading the poem. And these are obviously very positive, wanting us to honour the men, wanting us to respect them. So let's have a look at the language features. First of all, we've got imperatives. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade. He's telling us what to do, it's an instruction. So it almost demands that the reader gives respect to the Light Brigade. You almost don't have a choice when you're reading it, you're being told to honour them. And to back that up, we've got the repetition of the word honour. And again, like before, this almost creates a robotic tone. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade. It's almost as if Tennyson is trying to indoctrinate, which means brainwash the reader, into giving respect. He's trying to get that idea embedded in the reader's mind. We must honour them, we must remember them. So that's what we could say about the repetition of the word honour. And then the other thing I picked up on is the word noble, because we usually associate the word noble with royalty. Kings, queens, etc. So this word may have been chosen by Tennyson to manipulate the reader into looking up to the soldiers, just like we would look up to royal people like the king or the queen. So it's saying that they're that important, we should remember them that much because they're almost like royalty because of the sacrifice they've made for our country. And that's key quote 4. So when you've revised those quotes and you feel confident that you know them, which you won't have done yet because you've been watching this video, but you go away, revise them, make flashcards, get people to test you, write them out, whatever you need to do to help you to remember the quotes and the analysis, have a go at completing this table. This table's in your pack, but if not, just draw the table yourself. Don't look at the rest of the poem, don't look at any of your revision notes, and just see how much you can remember. In the left-hand column, you write down the quote, and then in the right-hand column, write down any language features that are in that quote, but don't just write the language feature, make sure that you write down anything you could say about it as well. If it's a metaphor, what does it represent? If it's biblical allusion, what is he trying to say? What's the effect on the reader? And write down as much as you can remember about those quotes. And once you've done that, if that works for you, draw the table again and have another go. Then maybe wait a week and have a go again, but keep practicing and writing down everything you can remember about those quotes. The final step, step 6, is to take the mini quiz on the poem. So when you're confident that you've revised this poem and you think you know it really well, so you've revised the quotes, you've watched the video, you've learned all about the context, put everything away so you've got nothing to help you. Don't keep a copy of the poem next to you. Turn the video off, make sure you've got no notes, and have a go at taking the mini quiz and see how much you can remember. Then in the feedback booklet, which is coming out on the website, there'll be a mark scheme so you can mark your own answers for this quiz and see which areas you still need to improve. Then go back and revise those. And my suggestion would be leave it a few weeks then and then come back to it and take the quiz again and find out which bits have stayed in your memory and which bits you need to go back and relearn to make sure that they stick there. And that's step 6.